everyone, I'm Anastasia. I welcome you all to this new session of Fundamental of Nursing. So in our previous session, as we have discussed about the infection control, the nature of infection, in this session, we are going to discuss about the chain of infection. So here, as we all know, that the life cycle of a pathogen is frequently described as an uninterrupted chain of events. So in order for this microorganism to spread the disease, they first need to grow, to reproduce, and then to move from one source to the other. So as I've said that the life cycle of a pathogen is frequently described as an uninterrupted chain of events. So here the chain of this infection includes the infectious agent, the source, the portal of exit, the mode of transmission, the portal of entry, and the susceptible host. So these are the chain of infection, and this infection develops especially when this chain is not interrupted. Which means if this chain is intact, then it can easily lead one to suffer from various infection. So how can we prevent this infection? We can do it by breaking this chain. So now let us discuss about this chain of infection in detail. As I've said that it first starts with the infectious agent, right? So what are these infectious agents? These are the parasites, protozoa, rickettsia, the fungus, the virus, as well as the bacterium. So all of these acts as the infectious agent which will be responsible for transmitting the disease from one person to the other. So as we can see that the first link in this chain of infection is the microbial agent or the pathogens. The ability of these infectious agents to cause diseases mainly depend upon the four characteristics. That is its pathogenicity, its virulence, its invasiveness, as well as its specificity. The more pathogenic, virulent, invasiveness the organism is, the more likely it can overcome the normal body defenses, causing one to suffer from infection. These four characteristics are also determined by the structure or the chemical composition of the microorganism. These four characteristics are determined by the structure or the chemical composition of the microorganism. So this is about the infectious agent. So as I've said that this can be the fungus, the bacteria, the rickettsia, the protozoa, parasite. What these will do is that they have the ability to cause diseases depending on its pathogenicity, virulence, invasiveness, as well as specificity. And here these four characteristics can be determined by the structure or the chemical composition. And the more pathogenic, virulent, and invasive the organism is, the more likely it can overcome the normal body defenses causing infection. Now, next, moving on to the source or to the reservoir. So here, a reservoir is an organism or a place in which these microorganisms survive, multiply, as well as wait to transfer to a susceptible host. A source is any place from which an infectious agent passes or disseminates to the host. And here the inanimate objects or the formites, the human beings as well as the animals also acts as a source of these infectious agents. So you may be thinking how these act as a source, right? So here these inanimate objects or the formites include the medications, the air, food, water, or any other materials on which an organism can find nourishment and survive. And in human beings, it includes the person who is already having that particular infection, the healthcare personnel, the family members, the visitors, as well as the other patients who will be present in the hospital setting. And the last one is the animals. So here these animals are often the sources of diseases, especially for human beings. And here insects and rats are the most common example. So here, as I have said that this source or this reservoir is a place or even an organism So these microorganisms can survive, multiply, as well as transfer from one person to the other through the inanimate objects, through the human beings, and even through the animals. And the next one is the portal of exit. So this portal of exit provide a means for these microorganisms to leave the source. So here, if an infectious agent is already present in the source, in order for that infectious agent to leave and to transfer from one person to the other, it can do it through the portal of exit, right? Where it will be able to leave from the source. And how can this microorganism leave? They can leave their source either through coughing, sneezing, insect bite, urine, feces, removal of blood, and also through the skin if there is presence of open lesion, and also through the skin cells if there is presence of an open lesion. So here, remember, the first thing is the infectious agent. These infectious agent, where will they be present? In the source, right? So here, when they need to be transmitted from one person to the other, they will be leaving the source through the portal of exit. And once they have left the source, then they will start transmitting from one person to the other, right? So once they have exit, so once they have leave the source, next is they will be transmitting from one person to the other. So this mode of transmission refers to the way in which this microorganism is carried or is moving from the source to the portal of exit. So here there are two main modes of transmission, that is through direct or an indirect method. Direct method is a method whereby it will be transmitted directly from one person to the other, for example through physical contact, whereas indirect method is the process whereby it will be transmitted from one person to the other, not through physical contact but through any other indirect method, such as through the inanimate or even the animate. So here there are five main modes or routes of transmission. The first one is the contact, the second is the vector-borne, the third is the airborne, the fourth is the droplet, and the fifth is the common vehicle. So let's discuss about each one in detail. First one is the contact transmission. So here the most common as well as the frequent mode of transmission, especially of the nosocomial infection, is divided into two subgroups. The first one is the direct contact transmission and the second is the indirect contact transmission. So this direct contact transmission involves the direct contact of the body surface of one person to the body surface of another person, causing the physical transfer of microorganism between the susceptible host and an infected or a colonized person. So from the name itself, we can understand that this is a process whereby the microorganisms can be easily transmitted from the infected person to the susceptible host when these two are directly in contact. This transmission of microorganism can occur when you are in direct contact with the client, which means this. So here from the name itself, we can understand that this is a type of transmission through handshake, hugging, giving them a bath, or even through physical activity. Then these microorganisms can easily spread from that infected person to the other person. Whereas indirect contact transmission is the process whereby this microorganism will be transmitted from the infected person to the susceptible host, not directly but through the use of various contaminated intermediate objects, usually the inanimate, such as sharing the use patient devices, contaminated instrument, needles, dressing, as well as by the use of the contaminated gloves. So here in this indirect contact transmission, what happens is that the microorganism can spread from the infected person to the susceptible host through the use of various objects which was used by that particular infected person. And the second one is the vector transmission. So this is a process whereby microorganism will be transferred from one person to the other through insects and other invertebrate animals such as mosquitoes and fleas. These vectors can be biological or even mechanical, where these biological vectors are living creatures that will carry these pathogens, and these can include the rats, the birds, as well as various insects. And this biological vector-borne transmission is further classified into propagative, cyclodevelopmental, as well as cyclopropagative. So when we say propagative, what happens here is that these pathogens will multiply, but there will be no growth. Whereas in cyclodevelopmental, these pathogens will grow, but there will be no multiplication. And in cyclopropagative, these pathogens will multiply as well as grow. So this is about the biological vector, which includes the living creatures in order to carry these pathogens. Whereas the mechanical vectors are the inanimate objects that are contaminated with the infected body fluid, such as the central line catheter, as well as the needle and syringes, which is shared by the IV drug users. So this is about the vector transmission through which the microorganisms or even the pathogens can be transmitted from an infected person to a healthy person through. And then moving on to the next is the airborne transmission. So how can it be transmitted? These microorganisms or the pathogens can be transmitted from an infected person to a healthy person through the tiny droplet nuclei that remain suspended in the air. And the next one is the droplet transmission, whereby microorganisms will be transmitted from the infected person to a susceptible host through the droplets, which can be generated by coughing, sneezing, or any other respiratory tract procedures like the bronchoscopy or even suctioning. So here it is very understandable that microorganism can also be transmitted through the droplets of an infected person. And then moving on to the next and the last one, which is the common vehicle transmission. So this is a mode of transmission in which these microorganisms will be transmitted indirectly by various materials which is contaminated by the infection. For example, food can carry, for example, salmonella can be transmitted by the intake of these foods which are already infected, or even one can suffer from HIV or hepatitis if they are being exposed to these infected blood. So that is about the mode of transmission. Next is the portal of entry. So here, after these infectious agent, how will they enter the susceptible host? These microorganisms can enter the body through various transmission methods. However, some pathogens have specific portal of entry. For example, some can enter through penetrating the skin, whereas some can enter into the gastrointestinal tract, respiratory tract, gastrourinary tract, as well as the placenta through the mucous membrane. And the parenteral route can also act as a portal of entry, that is through injections or even through the wound. And here, certain microorganisms can also enter the body of an individual through the ear, through the eyes, broken skin, insect bite, the anus, the urethra, the placenta, as well as the nose and the mouth. So here there are various ways through which microorganism can enter into the body of an individual and cause them to suffer from various infections as well as diseases. And the last one is the susceptible host. So who is the susceptible host? This is a person whose own body defense mechanism, when exposed to these microorganisms, cannot withstand the invasion of the pathogens. So here, in simple words, I can say that this susceptible host is a person who is likely going to get infected by these microorganisms because their own body defense mechanism will not be able to withstand the invasion of these pathogens. Some people are more susceptible because they have a low immune system, poor physical resistance if they are very young or if they are old, if they are malnourished, or even if they are suffering from any underlying diseases. So this is about the chain of infection, where there will be an infectious agent which will be present in the source, which means a place where they will survive, multiply, as well as wait to be transferred. And then comes the portal of exit, whereby they will be leaving the source in order to be transmitted. And after they have left the source comes the mode of transmission, so that they can be transmitted from the infected person to the susceptible host. And here, in order to be transmitted, in order to get inside the body of an individual, requires a portal of entry. So these microorganisms will be entering the body of an individual through various modes. And then comes the susceptible host, which is a person who is likely to get infected by these microorganisms because of their low immunity level, of their underlying diseases, of their age, or even because of their poor physical resistance. So then moving on to the next, which is the stages of infection. So here there are two types of infection. The first one is the localized infection and the second is the systemic infection. So what is this localized infection? This is a type of infection which is limited to a defined area or even a single organ, whereas a systemic infection are the ones which will affect the entire body or the organs of an individual. So these are the two types of infection. However, all infections progress through four stages. The first one is the incubation, the second is the prodromal, the third is the illness, and the fourth is the convalescent. So what is incubation? Incubation is the period between the time of entry of these microorganisms into the host and the onset of these symptoms. And prodromal is the time from the onset of the non-specific symptoms begin to manifest. And it is also during this stage that this particular client becomes infectious to the others as well. Whereas the third stage, that is the illness, is a stage or is a time in which the client will be having a specific signs and symptoms of the infectious process. And then the convalescent, which is the last, is a stage that starts from the beginning of the disappearance of these acute symptoms until the client returns to the previous state of health. However, the length of recovery of that particular individual depends upon the severity of the infection. So here, either it be a localized infection or a systemic infection, all these infections will have to go through these four stages, which is the incubation, the prodromal, the illness, and the convalescent. So now we have come to the end of this topic, whereby in today's session we have discussed in detail about the chain of infection as well as the stages of infection. So I hope you have got a clear understanding of this topic. I'll be meeting you in another session. Until then, have a good day. Thank you.